Hello, everybody. Let's wait a few moments for everyone to join. How is everyone doing so far this week? Looking outside, weather is nice for once in a while. No rain at all. All right, Benjamin, I feel you. Get well soon. Let me quickly swap my monitors. I hope that it will not break your visuals. So I have everything on site. Alrighty, then I would say let's begin. Once again, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar. And this time we will talk about mocking, stubbing, and spying, making tests predictable. I'm your expert today, Daniel, and I hope you will enjoy our webinar. So let's begin. Technical issues, hang on a second. Uh, so, um, so what is our goal? What is our goal in this webinar? Once again, we are talking about mocks, stubs, and spies. What are those actually? And why do they matter? Why should we use them? I give you some examples of each different part of it. One for mocks, one for stubs, and one for spies. Should be pretty obvious what the differences are and when to actually use them once you actually see some code. In this case, this webinar is more geared towards the developer side of things. If you are, for example, a test manager or maybe a project manager, you can stick around if you want to, but this time it's more on the technical side of things. So keep that in mind. Right. And at the very end, we have the conclusion about choosing the right tool, when to use what. Right. So let's start. What are mock stubs and spies? You can think of a stub as a stand-in that gives you a canned answer. For example, you have an API that always returns, for example, a user called Alice. In this case, we have something that is fixed, like our data response, and we don't care how it's actually used, right? In this case, we make it more predictable in what we get from an API call, for example. Contrary to that, we have the mock that pretends to be a dependency and checks expected interactions. In this case, we don't just replace the dependency, we set expectations. What does that mean? For example, in a payment flow test, a mock, let's call it example service, should be called exactly once with the correct subject, for example. In this case, the purpose is we check the behavior of the code and not just the result of it. At the very bottom, we have the spies. In this case, we wrap a real dependency and check the record usage, calls, arguments, counts, whatever. You could think of it as basically like a surveillance camera that watches a real object and records how it's actually used. What you can use it for is basically, example-wise, um, um, a logger that can assert something was called 3 times, but still let logging do its thing. So you can recognize if you have, for example, multiple calls of the same functionality, if it gets the right input data and the correct output data, and whatever you want to basically check for in this case. It's really useful to check for the real life behavior of your functionality that you want to uh, keep track of in this case. Now I give you some example calls. Don't mind the maybe funky look of it. I will break it down in the later part as well, just so you see what we are actually talking about. I have one screenshot for the mocks, one for the stubs, and one for the spies. As you can see, we have an API call, let's call it that, where we return something that is always the same no matter how you call the fetch user functionality. In this case, we expect the API fetch user name to be Alice as always, because it will always return ID 1 and name Alice. Contrary to that, we have the mock, where we actually implement a service, let's call it that. In this case, a functionality for an email service. We just create a functionality with jest in this case, that is JavaScript if you haven't recognized that already, where we place an order and then we expect to send out the email and check if it has been called with order confirmation. That is our mock in this case. You can see we implement a functionality and check if it works, but not as in real functionality, more like we pretend to be it being real in this case. Where's my mouse? There. Next up, we have the spy. In this case, we set just to spy on, basic English, basically, spy on the console and check for all logs. In this case, we have a function that is called greet user with the argument Alice. And this functionality just prints out hello Alice in the command line. And in this case, we expect logspy to have been called with hello Alice. It checks for the console if there has been an interaction with it, in this case, a log with the key hello Alice, basic. Why do they matter? I don't know if you have been into testing so much or into test automation, but we have all been there. Tests fail randomly. We have blocks for releases or something completely unrelated. We have slow CI pipelines. We waste our time. And even worse, we lose trust in what we do and what our software does. What we want in the very end, reliable tests that gets fast feedback, developer confidence, as well as maintainable code. That's the goal for us to have at the very end. Confidence is key. If you know that the stuff you do is correct, then you will go ahead and do much less mistakes, because then you tend to stick to your original idea and don't deviate too much because you think, that didn't work last time. Maybe this time it works in a different way, whatever. But if you do it this way, then everything is going to be fine. Also a thing, we call those triplets, we call them test doubles, because they basically double as functionality that we implement. Why do they matter, the test doubles? They help isolate the code. They help to control our conditions. For example, the mocks and the stubs. And verify our behavior, in this case, the mocks and the spies. Each of them can be used in combination or just solely just one. For example, if you have used, most of you probably have used it if you are a test automation engineer, the, what is it called again? Let's call it the spy functionality of your IDE or your debugger in this case, where you can step through each and every step that you do in your software, in your functionality. And by this, you've basically implemented some sort of spy. So every one of you should have at least used that once in a while. So it's not that far-fetched to think of it being really useful, not just for the testers, but for developers as well. Right, so let's get back to the examples once again, and let's dissect them a little bit more. In this case, once again, we have jest, and we call a function, and in this case, it's called mock return value. In this case, we have a stub and not a mock in a general sense, but you can call it mock if you want to, since jest calls it that, with the return value of a JSON object with the ID 1 and name Alice. Then we create a call, or a constant in this case, called user, where we call the API stub with fetch user. And in our case, that's basically the stub already. And to use the stub, actually, instead of just having it, we set just to expect user.name, like for the object that we receive, to be Alice, which should be easily verifiable since the stub will always be the same. If you have any questions regarding that, just message me in the chat. The mocks, same deal, but in this case, the focus is a little bit shifted towards the actual usage of the data that we provided with. Before, it's also, in theory, at least a mock, but since we have the focus on the data themselves, it's a stub. The mock is where we use it instead of having the focus on the data itself. In this case, we check if the email service can be called correctly and have been called with the order confirmation, in this case, for our email service. We have the email service constant that is just a send function provided by jest in this case. We place an order with the mocked email service. And at the very end, we say email service.send has been called with the order confirmation. Pretty much the same deal as with the stubs, but in this case, our focus lies on having the actual call, right? So last but not least, the spies. As I told you before, we have the functionality of jest to spy on different functionalities. In this case, we spy on the console and look specifically for log messages. In this case, we set it to a constant, so we can call it later. We have a question, a bit of a more complicated question. The jump between stub and mock seems quite large. Any tips on how to that makes that transition easier to manage? Right. As I said before, let's get back some slides. In this case, there is a gap. You are right. We can use both in tandem. In this case, we have to differentiate between having a mock and a stub. It all depends on what your focus is set on. Stubs are mostly used for static data that does not change. For, let's say, we have a website. We have eBay, for example, and a stub could be we just set the currently logged in user, right? So we just set user ID to 1 and name to Alice. So it says you are logged in as Alice, for example. That's the focus of the stub in this case. We can navigate all over the web page. In this case, we do it manually and not having to log in each time. If we look at it from a mock side of things, it's more like we mock the login functionality. In this case, it's an email service, but don't mind that. If you think of, we have the login page and we just set in login name Alice and password is password. Instead of it going to a backend, we have it all set in our code that it just returns true, for example, and then you are logged in as Alice, right? In this case, for example, it's like this. You could use a spy for that in tandem, where it checks if your login functionality returned with hello Alice, for example. you always have to think of what you are actually testing. Do you want to have, um, for example, the functionality tested that you just need data and work with it? For example, you are logged in as XYZ, or do you want to actually check if a user can log in? Then you use the mock. Does that answer your question, Benjamin? Uh, all right. If you have any questions, just message me and I try to answer it as fast as possible. Right. So going with the eBay example, yeah, in this case, we can hook the spy directly into the startup of our application. And once we are logged in, for example, in a mocked way, and we get the greet user message, then we can expect the log spy has some sort of reaction to it. In this case, it has been called with hello Alice because we are logged in as Alice in this case. You can think of it like, let's call it a security camera, right? It doesn't change the behavior of the software that we have, but it records what happens and can be used as an observation tool. The other two have direct influence of what our software does. The spy does not. Right. Um, Basically used for analysis, for checking what's happening with the software, and just as an observation tool. Let's get to our conclusion now. What do we use what for? In the stub, we use it for control. The mock is used for verification of usage in this case, and the spy is used for observation. What does that mean? Do I need fixed data? I use a stub. Do I need to check an interaction happened? We use a mock, for example, the login functionality, or for the stub, we just set a logged in user in this case. Do I want real behavior but also track the calls? We use the spy. I think it's rather straightforward once you actually get to use them, because everything that I've told you about today was basically stuff that you've probably already seen in the wild. Just maybe not with the same naming scheme, but yeah, I think everyone has had some sort of hands-on experience with that. And coming to that, I think we can come to the question part. Do you have any questions regarding the current topic that we have? I was quite fast this time, so we have a lot more time to answer questions. Don't be shy. I give you 1 more minute. We come to the end of our webinar. I think my connection broke for a second. Weird. Anyway, let's come to the end of this time webinar. So thank you so much for listening in to this webinar about stubs, spice, and now I'm a little bit off because I read a message. What are some situations in which you'd recommend spying, like to get usage? You could use it for that. You can use it proactively in this case for statistics, but what I would recommend using it for is mostly if you see misbehavior in your software. So you can use it proactively, but in the past, I've used it reactively. So if anything was wrong with our mocks or stubs, for example, I have used the spies to retroactively check if something is misbehaving because that's what usually our unit and integration tests are for, to check that behavior. But in that sense, I was mostly using it for the system test side of things, not just end-to-end tests, but in general, the software side. Right. Where was I? Yeah. Once again, um, thank you very much for your coming in today. We have current offerings for you. Sorry, I'm a little out of it. Thank you very much for listening in. We have a LinkedIn page. You can give us a big follow on Go Bigger GmbH at LinkedIn. We also have courses and workshops. You can find them under https://go-bigger.de/shop. And also, if you want to stay informed, we have a newsletter called Grow Bigger. We send out a message once per month so you don't get spammed by us. And we try to give you the latest and greatest information, mostly around testing, sometimes even specifically about the robot framework, which we are a part of since we joined like a year ago to the board of them. And yeah, if you want to subscribe, it's free. Go have at it. If you don't like it anymore, you can always unsubscribe. It's free of charge. So thank you very much for listening in. My name is Daniel, and have a nice day. Take care.